to the Fourth and Long Fantasy Football Show with Corey and Justin. Here they are, the Fourth and Long Fantasy Brothers.
Welcome to episode 28 of the Fourth and Long Fantasy Football Show. My name is Corey, and I am here with my actual brother, Justin.
Hello, this is Justin.
It's episode 28, and we are getting just that much closer to the fantasy football playoffs. Justin, why don't we get things started with some injury quick hits? Why don't you get things started with a very, very talented running back who got hurt this past week? What's the news with Dalvin Cook?
Yeah, Dalvin Cook came up gimp with an ankle injury. The good news is that the injury is not expected to sideline him at all. He should be good to go for week 13. Monitor reports, obviously, but I feel pretty optimistic he'll be out there.
Another injury looked terrible, Justin, and that was the one that happened to Josh Jacobs. Is he going to miss any time? What are the thoughts with him?
This is another one that I was looking at, because obviously Devontae Booker would have been a priority add this week, but the injury to Josh Jacobs is not as bad as they initially thought it was. He should be okay for week 13, but again, monitor practice reports as we lead into next week.
Justin, we have guys that we hope are going to come back from COVID inactivity, but there's another player who could potentially come back from inactivity that's this week, and that's David Johnson.
Yeah, David Johnson had the concussion issue, and he's been out for the last 3 weeks. This will be the first week that he'll be eligible to be activated from the IR. I'll be curious to see what the Texans do. Obviously, if he's back out there, he's a plug-and-play RB2.
Justin, another nasty-looking injury was the one that happened to DJ Moore. Any update on him?
Yeah, it was a pretty bad injury, right? I mean, it looked pretty bad on tape, but he's got the bye week here coming up. The Panthers are on bye week 13. He could be back week 14. The initial reports are that it's not as bad again as they thought it would be. So he could be back here for week 14, but keep an eye on reports.
Justin, one of last week's future segments was all about Jonathan Taylor, who ended up not playing because of a COVID situation. And we're going to talk about the Indy backfield in a little bit, but there is one situation that we definitely should talk about. And that was the fact that I told everyone to calm down about Alvin Kamara and that he's going to be just fine. It wasn't just fine, Justin. Did I underreact? And is this a bad thing for Alvin Kamara, this Taysom Hill offense?
The craziest stat is that Kamara only has one catch in his last 2 games. I think that's pretty crazy when you're talking about Kamara's bread and butter, right, of his game, the receiving chops that he has out of the backfield. Taysom Hill's made him what they call, mortal, I guess you could say, from a fantasy perspective. I think he's outside of the top 25 fantasy point-wise over the last 2 weeks. It's been interesting to see, man. 2 games is definitely a little bit more of a trend than 1, obviously, so it's something to be concerned about. I'm not going to discount him, though. It's Alvin Kamara, right? I'm just hoping and praying that Drew Brees is back sooner rather than later.
Yeah, you're not starting him. There's no reality in the world where you're benching Alvin Kamara because you're afraid of what this offense does. Assume that he's going to get touches and assume that he's going to make the most of them. But, yeah, I mean, we're going to talk a little bit in a future segment here about running backs and what you do with good running backs who end up in situations that are less than ideal. Kamara, who used to be in the best situation possible for a really talented running back, has fallen into a much different situation now. And I'm with you, Justin. I'm not writing this off. I'm not saying that he's done for the year. I'm not saying that, especially even when Taysom Hill's in there, he's not valuable. I think he does have value. I think we're going to look back at this and go, oh, wow, remember those 2 weeks? But I'm a little more nervous than I was last week. I was telling people not to worry last week. I'm worrying a little bit, Justin, this week.
Yeah, Corey, and let's also look at this going forward, right? I mean, this could potentially be Drew Brees' last year in the NFL. Obviously, it could very well come back for the 2021 season. But if Taysom Hill's the starter for the Saints here in the future, which he very well could be, does that lower Kamara's stock as you look into next season?
It could be. It could do it, Justin. I mean, it really, really could. I think we're definitely in a reality where if we're going into drafts with the thought that Taysom Hill is the starting quarterback for the New Orleans Saints, which I don't think would happen because as a thrower, he definitely did not impress last week nor the week before, although his stats look good. But if that is the reality that we're living with, Justin, I don't know. I think people are going to be much more wary of Kamara, maybe draft him more as a high-end RB2 than any kind of RB1, which is a crazy thing to say. I'm someone who says that situation doesn't matter nearly as much as talent, but here's a situation, right, where situation is sort of taking talent to the wayside.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy to think that if you extrapolated his catch pace over the course of a full season, he'd only have an 8-catch season versus, the 81 catches that you get on average from the Brees years that he's had. It's definitely a concerning trend. I'm not going to overreact. Obviously, you're still starting him as an RB1, RB2. It's something you got to be considerate about, and you got to think about it here going forward.
All right, Justin. Well, that sounds good to me. I agree with everything you're saying. And with that said, let's get to it.
On today's show,
All right, we continue our weekly format for you this week. Today, Justin and I discuss a past, a present, and a future topic as we reflect on week 12, the week that was, and we're going to get you prepared for your week 13 matchups. Justin, big news just broke a few days ago, and it was about one Houston Texans star wide receiver.
Yeah, Will Fuller, Texans wide receiver, has been suspended 6 games for violating the NFL's performance-enhancing substance abuse policy. Terrible, terrible news for this guy. You know, the interesting thing about this suspension, though, is that it's actually going to bleed into the 2021 season. So it has impacts on next year as well. And like I said, man, what a blow for the Texans offense here. Fuller was, finally staying healthy. He had really solidified himself as a weekly wide receiver one. He was on pace for almost 1,300 yards and 12 touchdowns. Instead, he finishes this season with 53 catches, 879 yards, and 8 touchdowns. I mean, still a good year from the young wide receiver, but this is going to have a trickle-down effect on the offense, and what sort of impact is this going to have on Deshaun Watson, the other wide receivers in this room, and then the running game as well. Now, I think from a Deshaun Watson perspective, there's no way to paint this differently, right? It's going to hurt Deshaun Watson. Losing your best weapon is never a good thing, and like I said, I don't think I can really paint it any other way. But, I think the arrow does shoot up a bit for Brandon Cooks here. He becomes the unquestioned number one option in this offense. He should see, 10-plus weekly targets now with Fuller out of the picture. And you got to also look at it, right? I mean, does someone else emerge in this offense, right? Does Kiki QT step up? Does Jordan Akins now step up? Or, do the Texans just put the load on, Deshaun Watson's shoulder? And does he start to run the ball a little bit more, man? I'll be curious to see what happens over these next few weeks.
Hard to imagine, Justin, that the repercussions from this are not just the offense for the Texans is just worse now. I mean, you can't take away one of the best, if not the best receivers on the team and claim that it's going to be all right. It can't be next man up, especially when you consider the fact that when you compare someone like Kiki QT and Will Fuller, like there's no comparison. Will Fuller is just a much better football wide receiver than QT. Yeah. And so, I got to agree. There's got to be some changes in this offense. There's got to be some philosophy changes. But yeah, I think that if you're a Brandon Cooks owner, I would say that that's really the only good-looking situation that's coming out of this. But otherwise, it's got to be a downhill trend for everyone else, especially Watson and this offense as a whole, Justin.
Yeah, Corey, we've yet to see Deshaun Watson with no either DeAndre Hopkins or Will Fuller in the lineup. I'll be curious to see how, kind of how he molds and bends with this change here. It's I think if you're a dynasty player, it might be a good idea to reach out to the Will Fuller owner, maybe try to see if you can snag him for pennies on the dollar. But, be curious to see how this whole Texans offense, which is really starting to take a turn for the better, how they kind of mold and bend with this next change.
Well, Justin, it's not impossible that good fantasy options and good football players can emerge in the absence of a star or a stud going down. And that's exactly what I saw in Indy this past week, Justin, with Jonathan Taylor going out this week. The Indy run game became an interesting situation to uncover. And what did we find? Well, we found that Nyheim Hines may be a pretty darn good running back if given the opportunity. While Jordan Wilkins has value too, he's just kind of a guy, and I'm much more intrigued by a backfield where Hines is the 1A to a more bruising 1B. He's one of the faster men on the gridiron this year, and Hines demonstrates an ability that trumps the likes of your typical passing down back. This guy is not James White. He's much better. And if given a more prominent role, like I said, where he's complemented by a bruiser, I think he can be a fantasy asset that could call back to the days of Darren Sproles, Justin.
I like the comp there, man. Yeah, I mean, he's playing with a quarterback as well that likes to check down to his running back position. We've seen Hines put up RB1 sort of weeks here, and he didn't totally take a stranglehold of the position this past week. He was in a pretty decent matchup against the Titans this past week, but I think he only ran for like 30 yards on the ground. But he did have 8 catches. He's a jack of all trades kind of guy, Corey. I think he's a great player. I agree with you. It'd be interesting to see how this backfield would evolve if he was given the full lion's share of the duties. But, I fully expect Jonathan Taylor back here for week 13. He should be healthy. I'd be curious to see how that unfolds here in week 13 and beyond.
Yeah, Justin, and I don't think he's someone who ever needs to get a full load, nor would I want him to. I think the poor guy would break in half. But I do think sort of a complementary role where he's also along with a guy who can go between the tackles is a really, really appealing thing for him. And if he ends up in a situation, whether it's next year or years down the line, where he's in that role, you're going to see me buying all over the place. Well, Justin, speaking about things you might want to be buying, on the waiver wire this week, what is it time to do?
Yeah, Corey, I think given the fact that we're, that we're a week, maybe 2 weeks in some cases away from the fantasy playoffs starting in most leagues, is I think you need to start to plan ahead, right? And go grab your handcuffs, especially for those elite running backs, right? You look at guys like Tony Pollard, Kareem Hunt, Alexander Madison, Devontae Booker, etc. Man, if you've got the space, go grab them. Now, hopefully you already have them, right? If you do have one of those elite running backs, you already have those handcuffs. But now it's time to go out there and double check your wire, man, because the playoffs are right around the corner, and I wouldn't want to be caught with my pants down here. If Zeke or Jacobs or Cook, Drake was to miss time here, their backups become must-start plays. And you look at some of the situations this year that have unfolded, right? If you're a CMC owner and you didn't own Mike Davis, ouch, right? If you had Chubb go down and you didn't own Kareem Hunt, man, you were hurt for a number of weeks. Hell, look at Wayne Gallman, right? With Saquon Barkley out of the picture. The dude is a touchdown machine. This time of the year, it's important to own those guys, and you want to go out there and scour your wire. Make sure that if you do own one of those elite backs, you can burn a bench spot, go grab the handcuff.
I agree with you, Justin. That's definitely a good short-term solution, is to make sure that you can finish off the year strong. Let's talk long-term, though, for a second. Let's talk in specifically dynasty and keeper league situations. What should you be doing right about now, especially as the bye weeks this week coming up are going to be completely a thing of the past? Well, let's talk about this for a second. In most dynasty or keeper leagues, you're typically looking, and this isn't exclusively, but mostly you're looking at deeper benches and some extra IR spots potentially. So now is the time. Trade deadlines may have come to pass, but there's still opportunity out there. What I'm saying to you is, if you have the room and your roster is pretty set, there are some guys out there that I wouldn't mind snagging and storing as we near the end of the season. Guys like, just off the top of my head, Marlon Mack, Damian Williams, and others can present a very appealing situation and possible trade bait in the offseason, even if you don't need them. These guys were valuable fantasy options before their injuries and opt-outs and COVID and all that nonsense. They often get lost because their weekly projection is 0. So no one's looking to pick up anyone who's going to project weekly for a 0 on your waiver wire. But if you're in and you're set, or maybe you're out of it, don't let those guys sit out there. Drop those scrubs from your bench and see if there's a diamond in the rough out there whose 2021 could look much better than their 2020.
Corey, one of my favorite examples of this is one of these kind of moves that I made in our keeper league back a couple years ago. It was the end of the 2018 season, and I went out and grabbed Patrick Mahomes, man. And guess what? I've reaped the benefits ever since. It's a great strategy, especially if you've already been set and you're ready to get into the playoffs, or if you're out of it at this point. Go out there, look at your free agency, see what sort of guys that are out there that could potentially have value for 2021, man. It's a great call.
Justin, let's talk about a guy that had value in 2020, though, and let's talk about the guy that has emerged, especially on Thanksgiving Day. Let's talk about Antonio Gibson.
Yeah, man. I think this was the official coming out party for Antonio Gibson, right? He's now become a household name, I guess you could say. Antonio Gibson is the first rookie to score 3 touchdowns in a game on Thanksgiving since Randy Moss in 1998. Good company there. He's played 2 games against Dallas, which has resulted in 200-yard games for Gibson. I wish he could play Dallas every single week, right, man? And he now sits in the top 5 for fantasy running back production. He's got 11 touchdowns as a rookie. That's pretty phenomenal right there. Now, the most encouraging takeaway was to see Gibson out-target and out-snap J.D. McKissick, his backfield mate. Now, was that a product of game flow? Or are we starting to see a shift here where Gibson becomes a 65 to 75% snap share player? His game has definitely evolved over the course of the year, right? He came in a bit raw, right? He was a wide receiver, kind of hybrid running back player coming out of Memphis. His protection and vision weren't quite good enough here to play, a lot of downs. But, man, they've improved week in and week out. Now, he's got a tough matchup in week 13, right, with the Steelers. And the reason why I'm putting this in the future segment is because I'll be watching to see how Gibson handles the super tough matchup and if he can keep his spot as kind of the bell cow here for the Washington football team this week and forward. Now, looking ahead, he's, in my mind, a top 15 running back in dynasty formats. And if he can keep this up, man, if he can finish the season strong, he could solidify himself in the top 10 if he continues to perform like he did in week 11.
Yeah, Justin, Gibson is just a great example of a situation where you have a good running back who's ended up in a really, really nice situation for him. And I want to talk about the antithesis of that, Justin. I want to talk about what happens when you have the Antonio Gibsons in the world, the good running backs, but in bad situations. And the reason why I want to talk about this, Justin, is because you and I actually brought this up about a few guys that we really believe are good, solid running backs who just seem to be in situations that are not good for their fantasy value or their professional statistics. Let's just talk about football in general. So let me ask you, right? What do Ronald Jones, David Montgomery, Melvin Gordon, Phillip Lindsay, J.K. Dobbins, and guys like Devin Singletary all have in common? Well, they're good, not great. I'm not saying these guys are elite or great by any means, but they're good running backs who are in bad situations. Situation is not king. You hear me say that often, but it certainly matters because what happens when a good back is in a good situation? Well, you get Todd Gurley, you get James Robinson, you get Antonio Gibson. These are reliable high-end RB2s or low-end RB1s. But are any of the guys that I just listed drastically better than the names I listed at the beginning of this segment? No to me. I mean, so the question is, what do you do with these guys? Well, my advice is you play them. Why do you play them? Because you've most likely saddled up to them for the year. Realize that the guys I've listed will have boom games because they're talented. But understand their bust rate is just so much higher than the likes of those other guys who are much safer, have a much safer floor. This is the epitome of the ceiling floor conversation in fantasy football, folks. Jones, Montgomery, and Lindsay, they have just as high of a ceiling as Todd Gurley. They're just in dramatically different situations. So play it out with what you have and realize, especially if you're in a dynasty or keeper situation, these guys may have increased value next year, but understand that this is what you have in a never-ending field of RB2s this year. Justin, if last year was a never-ending field of wide receiver 3s, I'm going to remember this year as the field of never-ending RB2s. Think about it. From anywhere from like running back 12 to running back 35, you basically have the same amount of guys who can give you the same amount of fantasy production. Just put them in a hat, pick out the one you like, and hopefully it works out for you. That's my thoughts on this situation. What do you think about good running backs in bad situations?
Yeah, man, paging Bruce Arians, right? Give Ronald Jones the 20 touches he deserves.
What about paging Matt Nagy? Stop throwing the ball all the time when you don't have a quarterback who can throw.
It's a good point, though, Corey, that you make. It has really become a very messy situation when you're talking about the running back, like 12 to 15 down to like RB 30. It's kind of a mismatch of, different running backs that could get you 2 to 3 points in a given week or could get you 15 to 20 points in a given week. I agree, man. A lot of it, we talk a lot in fantasy football about talent and situation, right? And there are just guys out there that are talented that are just stuck in really, really unfortunate situations, and they get labeled as bad fantasy players, as bad NFL players. That's not always the case, though.
Yeah, Justin, let's take this full circle, right? We're seeing it happen to Alvin Kamara. Great running back, was in an awesome situation, who has now been put in a situation where he's just not used the way he was. I mean, you're seeing it, right? I mean, as much as I want to say that situation is not king, it matters. It certainly does matter because these guys are feeling the effects of it this year.
Look at a guy like Zeke Elliott as well, right? I mean, is Zeke a product of an offense that's incredibly reliant on having a really good quarterback like Dak Prescott under the helm? I mean, he's another guy that's a talented running back who just has had a really bad stroke of luck over the last number of weeks here ever since Dak Prescott went down.
I think we can talk about this for hours, right? Think about Todd Gurley when he was saddled up with the Rams running game that couldn't go anywhere because he was just running them into the box. Then you bring in Sean McVay and it's a whole different story. Same talent, same guy, completely different situations. I think we could list examples until we're blue in the face, Justin. But with that being said, there we go. It's our Week 13 show, and it's in the books for the 2020 season. Next week, we continue our weekly seasonal episodes. We're going to recap Week 13 and get you ready for Week 14. Some folks' fantasy playoffs will be starting that week, and some people will be deciding who gets into the playoffs. It's crunch time, ladies and gentlemen. Remember to subscribe and hit the bell. Download, follow, like, comment, whatever you have to do to show some support. I'm Corey.
And I'm Justin.
And this has been the Fourth and Long Fantasy Football Show. We'll see you next time.
Royalty-free music courtesy of Ben Sound. The views and opinions expressed on today's episode are that of the Fourth and Long Fantasy Football Show. Remember to like and subscribe.